Welcome to Breaking Ground this morning. My name is Andrea Lynch. I'm a Principal Associate specialising in construction and engineering risks within our insurance disputes practice here at Mills & Reeve. This is the second part of our webinar on the Building Safety Act. The first part was hosted by my colleagues Ben Hardiman, Sophie Briggs and Dan Course on the 21st of September, and that is currently available to view on our Breaking Ground YouTube channel. In today's session, I'm joined this morning by my colleagues David Phillips and Adrian Kwintner, who also specialise in construction and engineering risks. Morning, both.
Morning.
Just a little bit of housekeeping. Please note this session is being recorded, and whilst you can see us, we cannot see you. So let's get started. So today we are going to be looking at the Building Safety Act in the context of the following three areas. Firstly, we're going to look at the type of professional indemnity cover commonly available to construction professionals. Secondly, we're going to look at the changes to the Defective Premises Act 1972 and the government's interpretation of those changes. And thirdly, we're going to look at potential problems that may arise for professional indemnity insurers and the construction professionals that they insure. We will finish up today by looking at a hypothetical case study arising from a typical construction project to practically apply the information discussed today. So Adrian, to get us started this morning, you are going to give examples of the wordings of the two most common forms of professional indemnity cover available to construction professionals.
Well, Andrea, for the first type of professional indemnity cover, we've got a couple of clauses from different insurance policies on the slide. These clauses tie the indemnity provided by the policy to some form of negligence by the insured. As you can see, the top one ties the indemnity to a breach of professional duty arising from any negligent act, error, or omission. The bottom one provides cover for a claim against the insured for negligence or breach of a duty of care. We will call these clauses negligence wordings. So under these clauses, unless the claim against the insured is one for negligence, there can be no entitlement to an indemnity, even if the insured are found liable on another basis, such as a failure to achieve a promised outcome.
Okay, so negligence and civil liability wordings are the two most common types of indemnities, but I've seen some professional indemnity policies which specifically exclude cover for certain types of cladding. Is that going to discourage the construction industry from taking on projects, for example, to repair unsafe cladding?
Well, Andrew, that has been a problem we've seen over the last few years with a lot of fire safety and cladding exclusions in professional indemnity policies. And that's led to a reluctance by contractors and construction professionals to take on cladding remedial works, or perhaps those works being carried out without adequate insurance cover in place. Now, to solve this, the International Underwriting Association, which represents non-Lloyd's insurers, has created a new fire safety clause. This is designed to provide cover for fire safety risks on building safety fund projects to remediate defective cladding from high-rise residential blocks. The wording specifically relates to building safety fund projects, but it could obviously easily be amended to cover privately funded remedial works. As you can see from the bits that we've tried to highlight here in bold, similarly to the first wordings, the negligence wordings that Adrian discussed, the indemnity is tied back to a negligent act, negligent error, or negligent omission by the insured.
Thanks, David. It's definitely going to be interesting to see how many insurers adopt the IUA model clause. But before we move on, are there any other professional indemnity clauses worth mentioning this morning?
Yeah, well, for completeness, we've included an example of a typical contractual liability exclusion. So we commonly find these in professional indemnity policies. They exclude purely contractual obligations. So typically we're talking about fitness of purpose obligations or guarantees related to performance. Ordinarily, these would apply when you might have a claim for breach of contract, but it doesn't involve any negligence or damage. However, as the Defective Premises Act is a statutory obligation, it will apply regardless of the terms of any contract between the two parties. So for that reason, Andrea, we don't expect these exclusions to apply to the scenarios we're going to be discussing later today.
Okay, great. That's a really good snapshot of typical professional indemnity cover. Adrian, what has any of this got to do with the Building Safety Act 2022?
Well, the question we're going to explore is how might the professional indemnity policy wording impact on an insured's entitlement to an indemnity for claims under the Defective Premises Act 1972 in ways which may not have been intended following changes to that act by the Building Safety Act. Section 1 of the Defective Premises Act provides that a person who carried out work in connection with a dwelling owes a duty to ensure that the work is done in a workmanlike and or professional manner, and so that as regards that work, the dwelling is fit for habitation when completed. If you give the words workmanlike or professional manner their ordinary meaning, then arguably that would allow for what is often known as a bolum or reasonable skill and care type of defence. In other words, if the work had been carried out in a workmanlike or professional manner, that would be a defence to a claim for a breach of the Defective Premises Act, even if the building was found to be unfit for habitation.
Thanks, Adrian. Can you just remind us what changes have been made by the Building Safety Act?
Well, the Building Safety Act extends the 6-year limitation period from practical completion of a dwelling for bringing claims under the Defective Premises Act. Now, for any claims arising after the Building Safety Act came into force on the 28th of June this year, a person now has 15 years to bring a claim under the Defective Premises Act. And a person who was entitled to bring a claim under that act before the Building Safety Act came into force now has 30 years to do so. This means any such claims arising from June 1992 onwards will be in time.
Wow, that's pretty extensive changes. Given the workmanlike or professional manner wording under the Defective Premises Act, is it reasonable to expect such claims to be covered under the negligence or civil liability clauses of a typical professional indemnity policy?
Well, Andrea, that's where some of our, I think, concerns come in. So to illustrate that, after the government tabled the Building Safety Bill, they published a fact sheet. They've since withdrawn that fact sheet, albeit we suspect that the reasons for doing so are unrelated to what we're about to discuss now. One of the questions and answers in that fact sheet are shown on this slide. And the question is, what if the developer claims that they were just following established practice at the time? I think we can infer that you could probably put the word contractor or construction professional in place of the word developer, and it would still apply. In any event, the government then goes on to say that a liability under the Defective Premises Act is strict. This means that no fault or negligence has to be shown in a claim. If a building is not fit for habitation due to defective work, then a claim can be brought. There is no space within the Act to consider whether the defendant was at fault, and there is no burden on the claimant to prove that. It is also not a valid defense in a Defective Premises Act case for the defendant to claim to have followed established practice at the time. So the upshot really is that the government's view on the Defective Premises Act is that liability is strict. The only test is whether the building is fit for habitation or not, and that there is no burden to prove that a defendant is at fault. And in fact, if you look at this answer, Andrea, there's not even really a suggestion that the defendant has to have had a role in the defect making the building unfit for habitation in order to be liable.
But Dave, doesn't that seem a little bit unfair to defendant construction professionals?
Yeah, it does seem to be an overly simplistic approach, and it can, of course, create unfair outcomes if a party simply qualifies as a defendant under the Defective Premises Act because they were involved in the construction process, but were not at fault themselves for the error that's caused the alleged unfitness for habitation. We would expect ordinarily that there would be some causal link between what the defendant has done and what the role has performed and the cause of the unfitness for habitation. Now, you could say that the remedy for the defendant is to bring a contribution claim against a party that they believe to be at fault for the unfitness for habitation. However, that seems to us to shift the burden of establishing the cause of the unfitness onto the defendant. But in either event, Andrea, I think the strict liability language causes potential issues around how professional indemnity insurance policies respond to Defective Premises Act claims.
So what exactly are the implications of these changes for construction professionals and their professional indemnity insurers?
As we discussed earlier, the extension of the limitation period under the Defective Premises Act will bring many more buildings within its scope. Whether this will trigger a wave of new claims isn't clear yet, but we've already seen some which reference the Defective Premises Act and which would otherwise not have been in time. Our initial view is that these claims would not have been brought under the Act but for the extended limitation period. But what is potentially more problematic is if these new Defective Premises Act claims simply identify the insured as a party to which that Act applies, that they took on work in respect of the dwelling and that it's unfit for habitation.
Well, Adrian, that very neatly brings us to our hypothetical case study this morning. Before I run through the facts of that case, just a reminder to our attendees this morning, we will be running a couple of poll questions to test your knowledge once we run through the facts. So if we just turn to the next slide. So facts of the case study are as follows. 2020, Finn Architects design a replacement facade for BSF, the Building Safety Fund, funded remedial works to cladding at a residential block of flats. 17 years later, 2037, there's a discovery that the insulation products contain materials which, when used in combination, unexpectedly become combustible over a period of time. The owners of the building bring a claim against Finn Architects, alleging the building is unfit for habitation under the Defective Premises Act, but they make no allegations of negligence. Finn Architects have a civil liability professional indemnity wording in their professional indemnity policy. So the first question and the first poll this morning is as follows. Does Finn Architects professional indemnity cover respond? So that's either a yes or a no. And just give people a few minutes to just looking at a really mixed bag of responses, but give people a few more minutes to vote on that. Okay, so 62% of the attendees this morning have voted yes. Adrian, what's the correct answer?
Well, Andrea, a successful claim against the insured would see it incur a civil liability for breach of the Defective Premises Act. How it has incurred that civil liability does not seem to us to be relevant.
Okay, great. So most people have gone with the correct answer this morning. Just turning to our second poll, a little bit more detail this time. If we can change that on the screen. So second poll this morning, what if Finn Architects professional indemnity cover contains the International Underwriting Association's fire safety clause? This is a reminder, it should be on your screen. So that's insurers' liability is limited to any actual loss incurred as a direct result of any negligent act, negligent error, or negligent omission by the insured. That's the formal wording. And so the question is, does Finn's Architects professional indemnity cover respond despite there being no allegation of a negligent act, error, or omission? Again, quite a mixed response from our audience this morning, David. We're just going to give it a few minutes. Okay, it seems to, wow, it seems to be leveling off now, David, and we've got 52% of people attending this morning consider that Finn Architects professional indemnity does respond. David, what's the correct response?
Well, Andrea, I think this is probably just a useful time to plug our coverage practice, because obviously here we've got a very close result, yes and no. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the claim against insured falls within this provision because it is a fire safety claim. And if the indemnity is intended to be limited to direct losses arising from negligent acts, errors, or omissions, it seems to us that there is a fairly good argument that the policy will not respond to that claim.
Okay. And what if the claim is made in both negligence and under the Defective Premises Act?
Well, I think that creates almost a more problematic situation, because the indemnity policy is triggered by the allegation of negligence, and the insured will be entitled to their defense costs in defending that negligence claim. What becomes problematic is, perhaps particularly in the scenario we've just described above, if this insured Finn was successfully to defend the negligence claim, but the building was still fit to be unfit for habitation, they could still be liable under the Defective Premises Act. Now, if Finn are not entitled to an indemnity from their insurers because they've not been negligent, and assuming that they don't have independent funds, then it seems to us that this results in a poor outcome for the claimant, who has a good claim but no financial remedy, and has also incurred a lot of costs. It's a poor outcome for the insurer, who's incurred a lot of defense costs that it may not be able to recover from the claimant. And it's obviously also a poor outcome for the insured, who has incurred a liability which it cannot meet and which is uninsured. So while the extension to the Defective Premises Act opens up a cause of action to a range of claimants who would otherwise perhaps not have had a remedy or a cause of action, either because they don't have a contractual relationship with the builder or the construction professional who is responsible for the defect, or simply because their claims are out of time. So that's positive from a claimant's perspective. However, for it to work in practice, it really has to lead to successful claimants being compensated when they do have good claims under the Defective Premises Act. And Andrea, I think, as you can see from our case study above, and also perhaps more tellingly from the polls that we've run, we are concerned that there are some circumstances where that outcome may not be achieved.
Thanks, David, and also thanks to you, Adrian. I think that was a very interesting look at the interaction between the Building Safety Act, the Defective Premises Act, and of course, professional indemnity policies. I suspect we're going to be talking a lot more about this in future Breaking Ground webinars, but that's all we've got time for today. And thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. At the end of the session, please do complete the feedback form, which will be on your screens when we sign off. Feel free to include any topics you would like us to discuss in future Breaking Ground webinars. And remember to also join us on LinkedIn. If you would like us to provide any more detailed answers to any of your questions this morning, please just drop any of us an email and we will communicate with you directly. In our next session on the 23rd of November, my colleague Neil Franklin will be discussing with colleagues the differences in the requirements and remedies for claims in negligence, contractual warranties and statutory obligations. We do hope you'll be able to join us then, and we wish you a good rest of the day.